She walked onto the parade ground in the early dawn light, her boots kicking up a swirl of dust across the cracked earth. Her uniform was immaculate, the creases razor sharp, the badge gleaming though she felt its weight on her chest more than ever. Before she was aware of every eye upon her and the hushed whispers rising like smoke in the air. Some of the senior officers stood under the shade of the mess hall, veranda, arms crossed, voices low and sharp glances flicked in her direction. Others leaned against the barracks walls half hidden in shadow. Some of the enlisted men dared to look away before turning back to stare. She moved with deliberation. She marched in the measured cadence. She held her head high, as if her resolve was built of steel. She was Lieutenant Rena Malik, assigned to Bravo Company, and called by many a token officer a figurehead. But she told no one she heard their talk behind their backs. She told no one she felt every slight, every passing comment in the mess, hall or the corridors or in the command tent. She carried it inside her lungs like smoke, and she held it tight in her heart. She would neither deny it nor bow to it. She would remain silent until the moment came when silence would break and the world would listen. She passed each formation squad after squad, standing at rigid attention, their faces straight and stern, their eyes fixed forward. Some nodded curtly, others did not acknowledge her at all. She kept walking until she reached the center of the square, the sun cresting over the horizon, gilding the barracks roofs and casting long, sharp shadows across the ground. And there she stopped. She turned slowly and looked at the wall of faces before her. She let the silence hang thick. Like a cloak behind her, she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came at first. She swallowed the dryness in her throat. Her lips quivered, and then she began her address to the company, but in a voice quiet at first and then rising steady with purpose. "Listen," she said, and paused. Though the word trembled in her chest, but the hush remained. She knew what she would not say and what she must say. She would not apologize for being there. She would not seek their approval. She would not play the part they expected of her, the token, the one given a position to prove diversity, not competence. Instead, she would speak truth. She said she had come to lead, not to occupy a chair. She said she would train with them, patrol with them, fight with them. She said she would demand their trust, but only if they earned hers. She said she would not tolerate excuses or cowardice or betrayal. She said she would not ask them to die for her, but she would die for them if needed. The silence hung heavy. After she finished speaking, no applause, no cheers, no applause in the barracks. Nothing but the shifting of bodies, the rustle of uniforms, the whispered breath of wind across the gravel. Some faces betrayed surprise, others thinly veiled scorn. All watched her with unreadable eyes. She stepped down from her small platform, the podium makeshift stone slab from the ruins of old foundations. She strode through the ranks back toward her command tent, her fingers brushing the seams of her sleeves, as if checking whether she was real. When she reached the canvas flap, she paused and looked back over the square. The men and women stood still waiting. She took a breath and entered the tent. The interior was sparse steel folding chairs, maps pinned. To canvas walls, a single table stacked with papers and orders. She crossed to the table and laid her palms on the cold surface. Her pulse hammered in her ears. Her thoughts raced. She allowed herself only a moment to steady before she moved outside, to her quarters to assemble her kit. The quarters were tight. 2 bunks, a locker, a small table with lamp, and a rack for rifles. She stood in the center of the room and gathered her breath. She closed her eyes and pictured what must come, what she must become. She considered the murmurs she had heard in the mess room about her being a token officer, a placeholder, a name to answer the press. She felt the jagged cut of those words in her mind, and she burned to show them wrong. She pulled open Her locker sliding each item out, stacking them on the bed, her uniform, gloves, boots, pistol magazines, radio charger, night vision goggles, and more. She arranged each piece with ritual precision. She examined every seam, every latch, every component. She tested the snap of her holster, the click of her mag, released the grip of her rifle. She ran through mental checklists, weapon optics, comms, protocols, clearing drills in her mind. She refused to allow her gear to betray her. Then she lay on her, bunk arms behind her head, eyes open to the canvas ceiling. She remembered the day she graduated her academy class, the first in years with no women. She remembered the jeers, the doubts from instructors, the raised eyebrows when she scored highest on marksmanship, then lowest on survival in desert heat, when they saw she struggled. They told her she had heart, but lacked grit. She vowed, then she would prove that grit would find her. She would survive. She would endure. She would rise. She drifted, in that half-dream, half-memory state, until the bell clanged, summoning all officers to the command tent. She rose at once, her body shaking with adrenaline. She stripped off the uniform shirt, changed into field gear, strapped on load-bearing vest, packed spare magazines, grenades, water rations, med kit comms unit, and finally her rifle. She slung it low across her back and stepped out into the glare of the morning sun. She marched to the command tent, arriving at the flap just as Colonel Vasquez emerged from within. He was the commanding officer of the entire base. Older, lean face, sharp like a blade under his wide brim hat. He looked at her, then at the officers gathered around, clutching clipboards and maps. He said the mission had arrived. Earlier than expected, intel reported movement across the southern ridge, a possible incursion too small to be invasion, but large enough to pose risk. He said reconnaissance units already deployed reported silence on comms sensors picking up intermittent heat signatures moving at twilight speed. They did not know whether friend or foe. He said, Command expected her to lead a small team into the ridge. At first light to gather visual confirmation. He turned to her and said, You will lead 5 men under your immediate command. You leave in 1 hour. He watched her face for reaction. There was none. She said, I will depart in 50 minutes and return to her quarters to issue orders. She walked through corridors awakened by the orders she posted on, bulletin boards calling her team to gear up. She found Corporal Omar, one of the few who had nodded to her in formation. She told him to gather Recon Team Echo at Checkpoint Bravo. She sent runners to wake other members to report she visited the armory and selected each weapon for her men, calibrating scope, zeroing sights, marking serial numbers. The brief she drafted was lean but firm objectives, threat assessment, rules of engagement, fallback points. The stall in the command tent hummed, like broken machinery with tension. She returned there at the appointed 60 minutes mark. Colonel Vasquez raised an eyebrow at her punctuality. Officers shifted in their boots. He motioned curtly, and they fell into formation behind her. Because of her rank, some had to serve under her, though their faces gave no acceptance. She led them out through the gate of the base, the dry wind biting hot like a blade across their necks. The ridge loomed ahead, jagged against the pale morning sky, the path narrowed, rocks underfoot, scrub brush that whispered in the breeze. They advanced in column, their boots echoing in the emptiness behind them. She counted their steps, estimated how far ahead the ridge stood. She scanned the horizon for movement. The heat haze dancing on the rocks. She felt sudden brush of doubt at her spine, but she swallowed it. She thought of the words she had spoken earlier about leading, not occupying. She thought of the whispers she had heard. She would make them see. She would not fail. They moved with stealth, their silhouettes swaying across dunes and rocks. She crept between boulders, paused in small gullies, listening for distant crack of twig or shifting sand. Her men followed her lead, silent like ghosts, but alert. She raised her hand and halted the column. She crouched low, signaling them to spread out. She moved forward alone into a narrow defile, the rocky pass narrowing ahead. Echo Team fanned left and right, covering her advance. She inched along walls of stone, scanning crevices, scanning shadows, scanning every irregular surface. She sensed something off ahead, a stillness too deep. The wind died down the scrub brush, unmoving. She signaled hold and edged forward until she glimpsed faint, dark shapes. Crouched half in shadow against the rock wall movement, then vanished. She froze in place, heart thundering. Her training screamed caution, but curiosity and duty drove her forward. She radioed to Omar, stay silent until visual confirmation. She advanced. A few more paces, then halted behind a protruding boulder. She peered around its edge and froze. Her breath caught. In the widening eye slit of her optic, she saw them nameless soldiers cloaked in mismatched gear rifles, half raised, staring outward. And menacing, and one figure high on a ridge looking down like a king surveying a battlefield. She swallowed hard as the defile seemed to narrow in around her. She pressed a hand to the stone wall behind her fingers, trembling but steady. She knew. The moment had come, and she would either stand or fall. The wind stirred behind her. She braced for what she must do next. The storm rolled in with no warning, a black curtain sweeping across the horizon, devouring the edge of the sky and turning. The late afternoon into a false night. Wind screamed through the narrow corridors between the supply tents, sending dust into the eyes and throats of the soldiers who scrambled to tie down. Equipment and secure antennas that swayed like broken spines, Lieutenant Rena stood at the edge of the command post, watching the last satellite feed flicker out on the screen before it blinked to black. The technician swore under his breath, tapped the keys again, and shook his head. No signal, no visuals, no data. It was as if Sector 9 had been erased from the map, and from the moment the connection died, nobody said what they were all thinking, but the fear was growing louder with every passing second. Because silence in a war zone was not silence at all. It was a scream waiting to break open. Senior officers gathered in the tent, their voices tense and clipped their uniforms damp from sweat and sand. They studied the blank monitors, the red pins on the maps, the growing list of unanswered pings from the forward patrols, faces that once exuded control, now tightened with unease. Their eyes flicked toward each other as if hoping someone else would speak first, but nobody did until the Colonel finally slammed his palm down and said, "We wait until we have more information." But Rena knew waiting would cost lives because she had seen this kind of storm before. Not just a weather front, but something tactical, something manufactured, to blind sensors and block signals. She stepped forward, her voice low and clear, and said she would lead the recon herself. The room turned to her in one slow, unified motion, as if she had shouted treason. Some of them laughed, not because it was funny, but because fear makes people cruel. They said she did not have the authority. She said she did not need it. They said she was not ready, and she reminded them she was the only officer with desert warfare certs and blackout protocol clearance. When they saw she had already packed her gear, already loaded her rifle, already memorized the topography of the ridge. Their laughter faded into a colder silence. One officer said, if she went out there, she would never come back. And she replied, then you will have one less person to question later. She walked out of the tent without waiting for approval, and the wind hit her face like a slap, reminding her of the terrain ahead, hard, ruthless, shifting with every step. She gathered her recon team quickly, selecting soldiers not by rank but by how they moved, how they held their weapons, how they reacted to chaos, because she needed instincts, not medals. She briefed them fast and lean, told them they were heading into Sector 9 to locate Bravo Patrol, and determine the nature of the blackout. She did not sugarcoat the risk. She said they would have no support, no drone coverage, no air comms, only grit and silence. They loaded into 7 vehicles, old desert transports with sand-worn tires and armor. plates bolted down from salvaged wrecks. The engines growled to life like beasts shaking off rust. The base gate opened with a reluctant groan, and they drove out into the storm visibility, dropped within minutes. Dust clung to the windows. The wind howled in every direction, and the GPS failed exactly 13 clicks from the base. Rena signaled to switch to manual navigation, and they began a slow, winding crawl through the broken valley where radio towers once stood, now crumpled like bones, crushed under weight. There were no tracks, no signs of battle, no flares, no distress calls, just the hollow crunch of their wheels on dry rock and the long, sharp silence that stretched between every heartbeat. Corporal Omar rode beside her, eyes scanning. The terrain constantly, fingers never leaving the grip of his rifle. He asked if she believed Bravo Patrol was still alive. She said if they were, then they needed her, and if they were not, then they still needed to know what happened. She knew he did not ask again because he believed in her or trusted her, but because he wanted to hear something that sounded like hope. The wind screamed louder, and the dust grew thicker, like a wall swallowing the sun at precisely 0300 hours. Their convoy vanished from the base grid. One by one, their tracking beacons went dark, and the command tent back at base lit up with warning lights like a heart monitor going flat. Officers scrambled, but no one dared send another team into that same storm. Not without answers. Not without orders. And as they hesitated, as they argued, Rena's team drove deeper into the dark, unmarked terrain. She began to see shapes in the fog, not solid, not fully formed, but flickering outlines moving just outside the reach of their headlights. She ordered a full stop, engines off, lights down, goggles on. They sat in the dark, the storm shrieking around them like a living thing. She strained her ears, but the wind drowned all else until suddenly it didn't. Because something moved against the wind, not with it. A low, crunching noise came from the rocks above like feet grinding gravel. She signaled the team to fan out, move low and slow. No lights, no sounds, just shadows on shadows. They climbed the ridge. Cautiously, rifles raised backs against stone when they reached the summit. She saw it. A small camp, stripped bare, half buried in sand equipment scattered like toy pieces. Tents ripped open from the inside, not by wind, but by force. No bodies, no blood. Just a terrible wrongness in the air, like the stillness before lightning. She moved forward, crouched, scanning for any sign of Bravo Patrol, when her boot kicked something buried just beneath the surface. She knelt and brushed away the sand, revealing. A helmet cracked across the front visor, shattered. Her hand trembled, but she did not stop. She dug further, pulling out a name tag, half melted by heat, and a rifle barrel bent as if twisted by impossible hands. She turned to call for her team and saw Omar frozen in place, his eyes wide, fixed on something behind her. She turned slowly, her hand tightening on the trigger, and what she saw made the world tilt sideways. Half a dozen figures emerged from the fog, not walking, not running, but gliding, almost. Their movements too smooth, their shapes obscured faces, hidden behind mismatched gear and visors cracked and smudged. Each held a weapon, but none raised them yet. They stopped just short of the camp boundary and simply stared, not blinking, not speaking, not moving. Her radio crackled, then died. The team circled her, forming a half-perimeter, rifles up. Breaths held. Rena did not give the order to fire. She gave no order at all because something in her told her this was not the enemy they had trained for. This was something else, something older, something that should not exist. And yet here it was, breathing, watching, waiting in the storm. And she realized then they had not walked into an ambush. They had walked into a message. One she could not yet understand, but one that would change the war forever. Rena did not blink. She did not lower her weapon. She simply stared at the figures ahead of her, motionless and silent, as if frozen in the act of watching her team from some space. Between time and war, the wind howled louder now, lifting small whirlwinds of dust between them. But still, those shapes did not move. The goggles over their eyes were cracked, smeared with sand. But somehow the presence behind them felt precise, deliberate, intelligent. Her soldiers tightened their grip on their rifles. Omar glanced at her eyes wide and questioning, but she did not speak. Not yet. She needed to understand what she was seeing, and more importantly, what she was feeling, because her heart was pounding not from fear alone, but from the sensation that they had crossed into something forbidden, something not covered in any briefing or mission plan. The camp behind her lay dead and dry, stripped of anything resembling normalcy. Bravo patrol had not simply vanished, they had been removed, disassembled, scattered like a warning, the helmets crushed, the weapons bent at impossible angles, yet there were no scorch marks, no bullet holes, no blood, no indication of how or why, and now here stood these silent sentries in mismatched gear with no insignia, no voice, no emotion, only the chilling stillness that made her skin crawl as if the very air had turned against her. She signaled for the team to hold position and slowly stepped forward. 1 pace, then 2. The sand crunching under her boots. The figures did not react. They did not lift their weapons or retreat or speak. They simply remained locked in that eerie formation as if waiting for something she was meant to do. She raised, her free hand slowly palm open, fingers spread, and then stopped because something shifted, not around her but inside her. A cold shiver climbed her spine as a low vibration began to hum through the rocks beneath her feet. It was not the storm. It was not wind. It was coming from them. She stepped back fast, her breath catching in her throat. She turned her head slightly and whispered to Omar, "We are leaving now. No questions, no noise, full withdrawal. Mark every step. Do not engage." He nodded once, then turned to relay her command to the others. But before the words left his mouth, the first figure twitched a single unnatural motion that made every hair on her body rise. It tilted its head slowly to the left, then raised one arm with a stiff, unnatural movement pointing toward the east, where the ridge split into 2 narrow paths. Rena froze again, weighing every possible meaning of that gesture. Was it a trap? Was it a warning? Was it a signal to others? Was she meant to follow or run, Chose. Neither. She activated her body cam, pushed the footage into the encrypted drive on her chest rig, and then motioned for the team to move out along the ridge back toward the western path. Not the direction the figure had pointed, but the only way she trusted now. She kept her eyes on the silent watchers until the wind swallowed them from view. The journey back was slower, more cautious, every step measured, every shadow. Suspect the storm had shifted direction again, now hammering from the south. Visibility was down to a few feet, and the convoy had to proceed in staggered formation. Rena rode in the lead vehicle, scanning constantly for motion or heat. But the world had gone cold. The sensors were picking up nothing. The comms remained dead. The last signal from base had cut out 4 hours ago, and the blackout had not lifted at the halfway point. The terrain narrowed between 2-step rock faces, and she felt it again, that vibration underfoot, faint but steady, like a pulse too deep for machines to register, but not too deep for the human body to notice. She called a halt, ordered the team to take positions, and scanned the ridge walls with night optics. At first there was nothing. Then a faint heat bloom behind a stone outcrop high above them. She zoomed in, saw a glint of metal, a shape that ducked out of view. The same type of helmet, the same strange silhouette as before. They were being followed not by one, not by a unit, but by something else that moved without pattern, without logic, something testing them, watching their reactions. She felt her mouth go dry, her throat tight with unsaid truths, because deep down she was starting to believe this was not about the missing patrol. This was not about enemy insurgents or rogue factions. This was about something that did not want to be found and had allowed them to leave for a reason she could not yet see. They made it back to the base perimeter. Just before dusk engines coughing and wheels dragging through the final stretch of sand, the gates opened slower than usual, guards watching with rifles raised, unsure of what they were seeing when her convoy rolled in every soldier, intact, but their faces drawn pale, silent eyes, not meeting anyone else's, as if speaking of what they had seen would bring it back. Rena stepped out of her vehicle and walked directly to the command tent, ignoring the calls of other officers. Ignoring the questions, she went straight to Colonel Vasquez, laid the encrypted drive on his desk, and said, "Review this now." Then she turned without another word and left the tent, not waiting for approval or debrief. She headed to the showers not to clean herself, but to be alone, to breathe, to let her hands shake where no one could see. That night she slept in full gear, her rifle within reach, her boots on her feet, her dreams full of stone faces and crackling air and figures that did not speak, but said everything in the way they moved or didn't. When she woke the next morning, the base was already stirring, but something was wrong. Soldiers were whispering again. This time, not about her, but about a strange phenomenon at the eastern ridge. Strange lights seen from the watchtower, the same ridge the figure had pointed toward the same direction she had refused to take. And in that moment she realized she had not escaped. She had been marked, tested, watched, and let go. Not because she posed no threat, but because she was being studied, and the war she thought she was fighting had just changed forever. The base was restless that morning. A strange tension hung in the air, like the electricity before a lightning strike. And though no one had sounded an alarm and no new orders had come down from command, every soldier moved a little faster, spoke a little less, and glanced toward the eastern ridge with the kind of wariness that came not from intelligence reports or threat assessments, but from something deeper, something primal, something they did not want to admit. They felt Rena sat alone in the mess tent, untouched food in front of her, steam rising off cold eggs and burned coffee, her eyes fixed on the rising sun. As it struggled through a wall of dust and cloud, she had not slept more than 2 hours. Not really. Her mind kept replaying the moment the figure pointed east, the strange vibration in the rock, the soundless stare of those mismatched helmets, and the way they had vanished into the storm like smoke into fog. She had reviewed the footage again frame by frame, studied every glitch, every flicker, every abnormal movement, and she had found it a brief distortion in the background behind the silent. Soldiers, a flicker of something that did not belong. A shape too large, too angular to be natural. A structure maybe hidden by sand and shadow. Something metallic half buried in the ridge. And when she paused, the feed at the right moment, the figures in the foreground appeared almost transparent for a split second, as if they were not entirely solid, as if they were projections, or worse, not of this world at all. She took the drive straight to Colonel Vasquez, who sat surrounded by intelligence. Officers, their screens filled with static maps and garbled transmissions. He looked up when she entered, and for the first time, his eyes showed more than annoyance or command. They showed concern and maybe even fear. She placed the drive on his table and said, "You need to see the frames between timestamps 0320 and 0324. He said nothing, just inserted the drive and watched as the footage loaded, and when he saw what she had seen, he leaned forward and whispered something to the tech beside him, who immediately began isolating the frames, enhancing the image, and running spectral analysis. "What are we looking at?" he asked, not in his usual tone, but in a quieter voice, as if speaking louder would make it real. She said, "I don't know. But whatever it is not human, or if it is, then it is something we have never seen before." She asked about the missing patrol, if any bodies had been recovered, and he said none. Not even signs of struggle. It was like they walked into a cloud and never came out. He said the brass in Central Command wanted answers, but they were also telling him to stay quiet, to suppress footage, to delay reports, because something about this blackout felt bigger than just one patrol or one recon mission. Rena asked if they were being told to stand down. and Vasquez gave her a look that answered everything without speaking. She left the tent knowing now that no more help would come. No reinforcements, no air support, and no clearance for further exploration of the ridge, but she also knew that the figures had pointed east for a reason, and that whatever waited there was not finished with them. Yet by that afternoon, the strange vibrations returned stronger than before now felt. Across the whole base, rattling loose bolts and knocking metal cups from tables. Techs in the comms tower reported static feedback without power. Soldiers reported dreams of sand and glass and eyes watching from behind stone walls. Rena gathered. Her team again, this time in private, not in the war room, but in the vehicle bay, where engine noise masked their voices. She told them what she had seen in the footage and what she suspected about the structure buried in the ridge. She told them the command would not authorize another mission, but she was going anyway, and she would not force any of them to follow her. But if they did, they needed to be ready to go off-grid. No tracking, no signals, and maybe no return. Omar was the first to speak. He said he had not stopped thinking about those things in the fog, about how they did not fire, did not chase, did not even flinch, and yet made every hair on his body rise like he had stared into the eye of something that did not belong in this world, and did not care what it broke to stay hidden. Then he picked up his gear and said he was in. One by one the others followed. Not because of orders, but because they had seen something that pulled them deeper. Something they could not explain, but could not ignore. That night, they left through the service gate under the cover of a scheduled maintenance convoy, their gear disguised and their route masked. They took the long way through dry ravines and narrow passes, avoiding satellite windows and drone patrols. Rena guided them by starlight and instinct, following the ridgeline east toward the spot where the figure had pointed and where something beneath the ground had pulsed like a living thing as they climbed the final slope. The wind died completely, and the air grew thick and heavy like walking underwater. They reached the plateau and saw it not a structure exactly, but a shape too geometric to be rock, and too ancient to be man-made. Metal seams buried in the dirt, strange patterns, etched into the surface, pulsing faintly with light like veins under skin. They approached slowly, weapons lowered, senses sharp. Rena reached out and placed her hand on the surface, and in that moment the ground beneath them began to tremble. The air snapped with energy, and every comm device in their packs lit up with unreadable code symbols, flickering across screens too fast to translate. And then a sound filled the air, not a voice, but a tone, a resonance that passed through bone and blood and memory, and brought every soldier to their knees, eyes wide with something between terror and awe. The surface began to shift, seams unfolding, plates unlocking like a door that had not been opened in centuries, and behind it, darkness vast and humming, with secrets older than the war, older than their language, older perhaps than their entire history. And as they looked down into that blackness, something inside all of them changed, not in fear, but in understanding, because this was not the enemy. This was not even a threat in the way they understood threat. It was a message. And now it had been answered. The light from the chamber below pulsed slowly, casting long shadows across the ridge and onto the faces of Rena and her team, who stood frozen. At the edge, their bodies still, their weapons forgotten in their hands, because something about the light felt not like electricity or fire or heat, but like memory, like the feeling of something you once knew but had long since buried. The humming grew louder now, a low frequency that rattled their bones but calmed their minds, and Rena stepped forward not in defiance but in recognition, because somehow she knew this place had been waiting for her. She descended first, boots landing on smooth stone that did not crack or shift or age, though it had clearly been hidden beneath the sand for longer than any human record. The walls inside were covered in markings, some of which seemed to rearrange themselves as she passed.